Margot stood near the back of the church, unnoticed. The stained glass windows cast fractured light across the pews, but none of it seemed to reach her. Her black coat, though simple, was neatly pressed. Her hands were folded in front of her, composed, as always. Yet inside, a storm brewed: grief, betrayal, and something harder to name. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more great content. At the front, on the first pew, sat a young woman with perfectly styled waves and mascara streaking down her cheeks. Jenna. She clutched a monogrammed handkerchief and wept as though the man in the casket had been her husband, not Margot's. The congregation comforted her gently, patting her shoulder, whispering words of solace. She played her part beautifully, elegant in mourning, fragile in sorrow. No one looked toward the back, where Margot stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had once meant everything to the man they were burying. The program, the one being passed from hand to hand, listed Jenna as lifelong companion. Margot's name was nowhere. She hadn't been asked to speak. No one had saved her a seat. There were no photos of her on the memorial table, just Jenna and Elliot smiling under golden sunlight, a curated history that erased the decades Margot had shared with him. 32 years of marriage condensed into a silence no one questioned. As the priest stepped up to deliver the closing words, Margot prepared to leave. She'd said her goodbye in her own way in the stillness of the morning, beside the garden Elliot had once planted for her, before the world decided her chapter was over. Then, unexpectedly, Father Daniel cleared his throat and said, "Before we conclude, Elliot's wife, his legal wife, Margot, would like to say a few words." Every head turned. The scrape of wooden pews, the collective shift of attention, was louder than the church bells that had once rung on their wedding day. Jenna's hand froze mid-sob. A ripple of confusion passed through the room, and Margot stepped forward, each step measured, each breath deliberate. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply walked to the front, where her place had been all along, and turned to face the room. And in that moment, Margot was no longer invisible. At first glance, theirs had been a textbook love story. Margot met Elliot in collegiate, idealistic young people swept up in shared lectures, late-night talks, and dreams of a meaningful future. He was thoughtful in the way quiet men sometimes are, and she admired that. When he proposed, it wasn't a grand gesture, but a question posed one rainy afternoon over coffee, with sincerity in his eyes and a steady hand holding hers. They married the year after graduation, in a modest ceremony held in the backyard of her parents' house. The decorations were handmade, the cake baked by her aunt, and the music played from a single borrowed speaker. It wasn't glamorous, but it was heartfelt. And for a long while, it was enough. They built a home together, small, imperfect, and entirely theirs. Margot took on a teaching job at the local elementary school, while Elliot started at a regional insurance firm. She cooked meals from scratch, ironed his shirts with care, and stayed up late grading papers. When their daughter Na was born, Margot stepped into motherhood with grace. She made baby food in batches, read parenting books from cover to cover, and memorized every lyric to Na's favorite lullabies. She was the anchor of their home, though she rarely named it as such. Elliot never raised his voice. He never left bruises or stormed out the door. He provided, came home on time, and fulfilled every visible duty of a husband. On the surface, their marriage appeared calm and troubled, even admirable. Friends would often remark on how low maintenance their relationship seemed. No fights, no scandals, no upheaval. But quiet can be deceiving. Over the years, Elliot's warmth thinned out, like tea steeped too many times. Conversations became utilitarian. Did you pick up the mail? Can you take Na to piano lessons? Eye contact grew brief. Affection was reduced to the occasional pat on the shoulder or a birthday card signed with nothing more than his name. He never complained, but he also never noticed. Whether Margot wore a new dress, trimmed her hair, or rearranged the living room, there was no reaction. Still, there was no infidelity, no yelling, no betrayal she could point to. So Margot convinced herself this was just what long marriages became: quiet, uneventful, and practical. The passion of youth gave way to the steadiness of companionship. She told herself that love didn't always have to be loud. But deep down, in the places she rarely visited, even in thought, she missed being seen. Not just looked at, but truly seen. Noticed, acknowledged. She missed laughter that wasn't forced. Missed questions about how she was doing. Missed the version of herself that once felt like more than a role. She told herself this was enough. That other women had it worse. That a home without conflict was a blessing. But the truth was simpler and sadder. She had accepted neglect because it came without bruises, and silence because it came without shouting. And so, the marriage endured not because it thrived, but because Margot had long mistaken endurance for love. At first, it was subtle, too subtle to call a betrayal, but enough to trouble the quiet spaces between them. Margot noticed the change, the way you notice seasons shifting not with a storm, but with the slow drift of air turning colder. Elliot's phone never left his side. Once left unattended on the kitchen counter or forgotten on the bathroom sink, it was now always in his pocket, face down, screen dimmed. When it vibrated, his fingers moved quickly, too quickly to silence it. Once, Margot caught a glimpse of a message bubble as he turned away. Just a name, no last name, a single red heart. She said nothing. Not that day, not the next. The scent of unfamiliar perfume began to linger on his collar suite, citrusy, not the sandalwood Margot wore. He claimed it was a new office air freshener. She smiled and nodded. She had been married long enough to know when a man was rehearsing lines. Questions brewed, but she kept them steeped in silence. Not because she was afraid of the truth, but because she feared what the truth would do to the memory of everything before it. Elliot grew evasive when she asked about his schedule. He started staying late more often, citing meetings that never showed up on his calendar. When she asked if she could join him at one of the company functions, he hesitated, then offered a polite excuse about limited seating and corporate protocol. It was the kind of lie that wasn't cruel in words, only in intention. And then came the gala. A black tie charity event held at the Downtown Art Museum. Margot had insisted on attending on principle, if nothing else. She wore a navy gown she hadn't taken out in years, paired with pearl earrings Elliot had given her their 10th anniversary. She hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the night would restore some semblance of the partnership they once had. It didn't. From the moment they arrived, Elliot drifted. Not out of necessity, but by choice. He introduced Margot to no one, left her standing alone by the sculpture garden with a flute of untouched champagne. She spotted him across the room, laughing too freely with a woman in crimson. Jenna. That was her name. She placed her hand on Elliot's arm like she had done it 1,000 times before. He didn't flinch, didn't move away. In that moment, Margot saw it clearly. She was not his partner that night. She was a +1, with no context, no relevance, no place. Margot didn't cry. Not then. But something inside her part that still hoped broke quietly, like glass under velvet. She smiled at strangers, nodded at speeches, even clapped when the auction closed. But inside, she grieved not just the betrayal, but the realization that the man she once called husband had been slowly disappearing long before that evening. And perhaps she had been disappearing too. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, an unassuming brown parcel, wrapped neatly in plain paper, resting at the doorstep like any other package. Margot had nearly stepped over it as she brought in the morning paper. She wasn't expecting anything. The return address had Elliot's name printed neatly in the top corner. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Her first thought was practical, perhaps, something he'd ordered before his passing. A legal document, a forgotten task, a final detail. But something in the weight of it felt personal, like a secret not meant to surface. She carried it to the kitchen table, where light from the window fell softly across the surface. Her hands hovered over the flap. She paused, then she opened it. Inside was a velvet box, the kind that knew it held something important, and a Cardivory paper, smooth and thick, the handwriting unmistakably Elliot's. His familiar looped letters read, "To the one who makes my heart feel young again." Margot stared at the words, her breath caught. Her eyes dropped to the name signed below. Love always, Elliot. But it wasn't signed to Margot. It was addressed to Jenna. It felt like time stopped. Her chest hollowed out with a coldness no widow should have to feel. There, nestled in the box, was a delicate gold necklace. A single pearl in the center, timeless, tasteful, elegant. It wasn't her style, it was Jenna's. The younger woman's fondness for understated jewelry had always been noted at the church gatherings. Margot didn't cry. She closed the box, folded the card with precision, and placed them both back into the parcel. She didn't scream, didn't shatter anything, didn't fall to her knees. There was no gasp for air, no collapse of grief. There was only silence. And something inside her shifted. Later that afternoon, Margot walked to the garden behind the house, the one Elliot had always promised to tend. The rosebush he'd once planted with the words, "This will be our place," had since been left to wilt, its soil dry, the petals browned before their bloom. She knelt, carefully digging a small space beneath the roots. No ceremony, no ritual. She buried the box there, the necklace, the letter, all of it. Not out of vengeance, but preservation, an unspoken tombstone marking the final moment she chose herself over the illusion of being cherished. For years, Margot had watered a garden Elliot never cared for, held on to a marriage he'd already let go of, and defended a man who'd been silently shifting his devotion elsewhere. Now, under the shadow of that neglected rosebush, she made her final withdrawal. She stood up slowly, brushed the dirt from her hands, and whispered to the thorns, "You don't get to bloom for her, not from the soil I kept alive." That night, she slept soundly. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the absence of pretending. And sometimes, that's the first step to freedom. Margot didn't scream. She didn't set fire to old letters or smash framed memories in the hallway. There was no dramatic exit, no shouting match, no vengeful speech. Instead, her revolution began in whispers, paper thin but powerful. One morning, before the sun rose too high, she sat down at her dining table with a warm mug of tea and a stack of envelopes. Her hands, though weathered, moved with calm purpose as she flipped through statements, contracts, and certificate traces of a life she had once shared, now being redefined, piece by piece. The first stop was the bank. She closed the joint account she'd once opened with Elliot, one they'd barely used since he began keeping separate finances for convenience. A young teller smiled politely. Unaware that she was witnessing a chapter close in real time, Margot smiled back, her heart beating steady. Then came the notary. The will was rewritten, her assets no longer divided out of duty, but directed toward causes that had touched her life in more meaningful ways. A scholarship for single mothers, a donation to the library where she'd spent rainy afternoons, and a trust for her goddaughter, who visited not out of obligation, but love. She changed her emergency contact, her health proxy, even the name on her mailbox. Elliot's name disappeared like ink fading under sun quietly, without need for drama. Not to erase history, but to release herself from its grip. The house no longer echoed with his presence. She boxed up what was Hish's books, his cufflinks, his favorite wine glasses, and arranged for them to be picked up. There was no note, no explanation, just space reclaimed. Her lawyer raised an eyebrow at the list of revisions Margot requested. "Starting fresh?" he asked. Margot answered with a soft smile. "No, just starting true." She didn't announce her changes to the world. She simply lived with them. She planted rosemary on the balcony, started attending yoga at the community center, and began journaling again. Her words flowed like a stream, unblocked, free, unfiltered, hers. And when someone asked why she hadn't made a scene or confronted Elliot, she simply replied, "I wasn't seeking justice. I was reclaiming peace." Margot's transformation wasn't loud, but it was profound. Because sometimes the strongest kind of power isn't revenge. It's removing your name from a life where it was no longer spoken with love. The church was dressed in solemn white lilies and hushed grief. Candles flickered under stained glass, casting gentle halos over mourners who filled the pews. Yet among them, one woman sat unnoticed, quiet, composed, almost invisible. Margot. She hadn't been invited, of course. Jenna had arranged everything. From the glossy obituary naming herself as Elliot's devoted partner, to the reserved seats filled with her family, to the slideshow of memories that carefully excluded any trace of Margot's decades-long marriage to him. It was as if she had never existed, as if the years spent beside Elliot through hardship, through loss, through quiet Sunday mornings and bitter arguments had evaporated into nothing. But Margot did not flinch. She sat in the second-to-last pew, wearing the same navy dress she had worn to Elliot's retirement, banquet dignified, understated, and perfectly pressed. Her eyes, though tired, remained steady. The service unfolded with scripted grace. Jenna sobbed at the podium, accepting condolences like a grieving widow. Friends and colleagues spoke of Elliot's accomplishments, his generosity, his charm. No one mentioned Margot, no one dared. Until the final reading. The priest, clearing his throat with slight hesitation, looked toward the back of the church. Elliot left behind something more than memories, he began. His final wishes, expressed clearly and legally, were meant to be shared with all of you. Jenna stiffened. Margot remained still. The priest continued, voice firmer now. As per Elliot's most recent and binding will, dated just 8 months ago, all of his personal and financial assets, including property, investments, and heirlooms, to be transferred to his lawful wife, Margot Wells. Gasps rippled through the congregation like wind across a quiet lake. Jenna turned pale. And then, slowly, gracefully, Margot stood. She walked toward the altar with poise that demanded attention. No vengeance in her steps, no smugness in her gaze, only a quiet strength. When she reached the front, she turned to face the room. I'm not here to take back anything, she said softly, only to remind us all of what cannot be erased. She paused. Love without truth is performance, and a legacy built on silence will always unravel. Then she nodded once, gently, and returned to her seat. And in that moment, without shouting, without anger, without revenge, Margot reclaimed her place. Not just in the room, but in the story. The truth didn't arrive with a bang. It came quietly, in the form of a neatly worded email from Margaret's longtime accountant, Lillian. A monthly financial review, just as they'd always done since Margaret had retired from her career in education. Only this time, it included a flag. Margaret, the message read, I've noticed repeated irregularities in the clinic's expense account. Specifically, transactions tied to Jenna's name, though there is no official documentation confirming her employment status. Shall we talk? Margaret didn't reply immediately. She sat with the words, letting them echo in the stillness of her apartment. Jenna, her own granddaughter, had been using her name, her kindness, her trust, to siphon funds from the women's clinic Margaret had helped build. A place founded on service, now quietly exploited. Not for survival, but for convenience. And yet, Margaret didn't feel rage. What filled her instead was a deep, familiar ache. One she had learned to name betrayal without violence, exploitation without apology. The next morning, she met Lillian over tea. The facts were clear. Jenna had no official title, no contract, yet used clinic resources, freely taking advantage of Margaret's name as cover. Still, Margaret chose not to litigate, not to shame. She simply called Jenna in for a conversation. I know what's been happening, Margaret said calmly. I'm not angry, just done. Jenna paled, fumbled for excuses, but Margaret gently raised a hand. There's no need to explain. You're free to go, quietly. No letters, no calls, no second chances. The news spread quickly in quiet circles. Margaret, the founder, the face of the clinic, had stepped back, but not without care. In a move few anticipated, she sold the clinic for a symbolic $1 to a team of 3 young female doctors. Idealistic, compassionate, and committed, they represented the next chapter. She renamed the clinic The Second Bloom. It was a legacy not of control but of continuity. Justice, Margaret believed, didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it simply let go with grace. Angela stood at the entrance of the well house, her hands clutching a small pot of marigolds. The vibrant petals quivered slightly in the breeze, mirroring the tremor in her heart. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, yet now, words seemed elusive. Margaret opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words and past regrets. "May I come in?" Angela's voice was barely above a whisper. Margaret stepped aside, allowing her daughter to enter. They sat across from each other, the marigolds placed gently on the table between them. "I've been thinking a lot," Angela began, her gaze fixed on the flowers. "About us, about everything." Margaret nodded, waiting. "I realize now how much I took you for granted," Angela continued. "I saw your help as a given, not as the gift it was. I'm sorry." Margaret's eyes softened. "Thank you for saying that." They sat in silence, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. "I want to rebuild our relationship," Angela said finally. "Not as mother and daughter bound by obligation, but as two women choosing to be in each other's lives." Margaret smiled gently. "That's all I've ever wanted." They decided to plant the marigolds together in the community garden, a symbol of new beginnings. As they worked side by side, hands in the soil, a sense of peace settled over them. "Love isn't a debt to be repaid," Margaret said, patting the earth around the flowers. "It's a seed that grows with care and respect." Angela looked at her mother, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then let's nurture it together." In that moment, amidst the blooming flowers and the promise of spring, they found the first steps toward healing a journey not defined by the past, but by the choices they made together in the present. The small apartment, once a temporary retreat, had gradually become a sanctuary. Margaret no longer saw it as an escape, but as the foundation of something quietly powerful. She rearranged the living room with intention, placing her favorite armchair by the window where morning light poured in. The old wooden bookshelf was now filled with novels, memoirs, and seed catalogs, each spine a testament to her journey of restoration. She joined a local book club, her mind alive again with conversation that didn't revolve around grocery budgets or school pickups. On Tuesdays, she walked with a senior walking group in the park, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She had returned to writing, filling page after page in a new leather-bound journal. It wasn't just recounting events, it was rewriting her inner narrative. One morning, she sat for an interview at the local library, a volunteer position assisting with children's reading hours and senior literacy programs. Her voice, once quieted by dismissal, found new purpose in the shared joy of stories. The librarian, a woman half Margaret's age, listened intently and smiled. "We could really use someone like you." At the Well House, Margaret continued her weekly storytelling sessions with the residents. The rooftop garden flourished under her care, rows of basil, lavender, and tomatoes reaching up under the city sky. Her favorite afternoons were spent with the women, each with their own scars, their own silences. Together, they were rewriting what it meant to grow older. Someone once asked Margaret if she had forgiven her daughter. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the garden and said softly, "Love isn't a debt to be repaid. It's a seed. It only grows where there's respect." Because the truth she had come to accept was simple, yet profound. You can be erased from someone else's life, but you still get to write your own story. You don't have to shatter the past to build a future. You don't need to yell to be heard, you only need to stand. And silence? Silence isn't weakness. It's the most dignified form of strength. Margaret was no longer anyone's burden. She was her own beginning.